Yeah.
You haven't mentioned the historical component of Japan. That's very informative. Would you mind folding that into your discussion?
Sure. So the relevance of Japan for this part of the talk, or for this talk, is Japan from shortly after World War II, 1955 to be exact, until 1993, I think, had a single ruling party in power. So that is 38 years. That party was the Liberal Democratic Party, right? Yeah.
I meant differently, the role of Japan in having...
Oh, in the Taiwanese?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So...
Thank you.
Okay. So the colonial era is what we're talking about.
It was an extensive experience.
Right. So, I didn't mention that. In a longer version of this talk, I actually talk about the colonial experience a little bit. So another part of why you get this this self-identification trend here is that there is a very clear difference, especially shortly after World War II, between people raised under the Japanese from 1895 to 1945 and people raised post-45 or who came over on the mainland, right? And so there are some very clear generational patterns in Taiwan. You see a much stronger feeling of Taiwanese identity among folks who came of age under the Japanese, experienced the early years of KMT rule, the White Terror regime, the Erba-Shijian, and so the 228 incident. But those people are largely passing from the scene now. Okay? So there's clear generational divides. Most of the people who were raised and came of age under the Japanese are quite old now. They're at least as old as Li Denghui. And so in the future, going forward, I expect this kind of tortured legacy of Taiwanese history to matter a lot less in elections.
But what's interesting is Taiwanese identity keeps rising even with this generational replacement.
Yeah, they're still governed separately, and they still have the PRC is kind of the boogeyman in the background here, right?
It's a different set of reasons.
Yeah.
So let me pose a question, first a comment. I think that this is a very important study from a comparative politics point of view, because the literature in comparative politics has been biased toward parliamentarism.
Yeah.
There's a general argument out there, Leiphardt, Wanlins, and so on, that I'll state on, that parliamentary rule is better. And this is the most important argument I've seen made for presidentialism, actually, in response to that kind of dominant bias in the political science literature for some time. And it matters if you think that competitiveness is an important element of the quality of democracy. But it still leaves a different problem, which Taiwan experienced under Chen Shui-bian and will, as you know, probably experience again if the DPP wins the presidential election in 2016, which is that you get alternation in ruling parties, but then with mighty problems in terms of presidential legislative relations. So I don't know if because the president has to face a hostile majority in parliament. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how Taiwan might address that problem going forward.
Yeah. So I did a lot of work on survival, the duration analysis in this dissertation, and one of the things that really came out as an important variable was the age of the regime. And so as democracies age, they consolidate, and they tend to have both more regular turnover and kind of more predictable turnover as well. And so, this may be a kind of what do I want to say? A Pollyannish view, I guess, of Taiwan's development, but aging having this experience of rotating in power and knowing that you're not going to be there forever and that you have to work with the guys across the aisle, and that's going to happen in the future quite a bit too. That's a lesson that has to be learned over time, and once you learn it, you're more likely to get moderate cooperation. So that
pragmatism, cooperation.
Yeah.
Consensus building.
Right.
Like we have in the U.S. Congress now.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
No, I generally agree with you, but I couldn't resist that observation.
How many years is the maturity for democracy? How many years of...
How many years does it take?
How many years does it take until you get kind of a consolidated democracy?
Or that kind of maturity that promotes more pragmatism and cooperation?
Actually, simply changing from... so there's a strong, what I'll call a first incumbent effect. The first incumbents last a really long time in a lot of these regimes. So there's a first incumbent advantage. And once the first incumbents lose and there's a transfer of power, that advantage largely disappears. By about 2 transitions, there's at least, so I'm not directly answering your question, but there's at least regular rotation in power. I don't really have data to get at whether you have moderation of views among opposition and incumbent parties, but that would be where I would get that data, actually. That's an interesting question. I will think about that a little bit more. Comparatively, though, democracies tend to consolidate pretty quickly. If you get past about 10 years, chances of you reverting to an authoritarian regime are quite low. The real problems happen very early on in the first 10 or so years. Okay, so Taiwan has already passed that threshold.
Well, please join me in thanking Kharis Templeman for this really great talk. And 2 weeks from today, we're going to have another seminar. It will be the last seminar of this quarter, and it will be literally 2 weeks from today here in a different room upstairs. And David Law, who is a professor of law at Washington University, St. Louis, will talk about Taiwan's judicial system. So thank you all very much.
Okay.